Hello, and welcome back to Bedtime Story. Before we begin tonight's tale, I'd love to know where you're listening from. If these stories have become part of your nightly routine, consider leaving a like and subscribing. It really helps the channel. Now get comfortable, settle in, take a deep, calming breath, and let's begin. In this new story. Not every ghost story begins with whispers in the dark or legends repeated around campfires. Some begin inside sheriff's offices, county archives, and emergency dispatch centers where investigators quietly document events that never receive satisfying conclusions. Across the United States, especially in isolated Appalachian communities, there are investigations that remain open not because detectives stopped searching, but because every reasonable explanation eventually reached a dead end. One such investigation started during the winter of 2017 when a long-abandoned funeral home in a quiet West Virginia town became the center of repeated emergency calls that no responding officer could fully explain. The Mercer Funeral Home had served local families for more than 6 decades before permanently closing after its longtime owner retired. Following the closure, the building remained vacant while legal disputes delayed the sale of the property. County records confirmed that electrical service, natural gas, water, and security monitoring had all been disconnected nearly 18 months earlier. Every exterior entrance had been secured with new locks, and the estate representative conducted monthly inspections documenting that the building remained completely empty. For almost 2 years, nothing unusual was reported, and the property slowly faded into another forgotten landmark standing silently along the edge of town. Everything changed during the final week of January when a county snowplow operator contacted dispatch after completing his overnight route. While driving past the funeral home shortly before sunrise, he clearly noticed warm yellow light shining through a second-floor hallway window. Because severe winter weather often required utility crews to perform emergency repairs before daylight, he initially assumed maintenance workers had entered the building. Only later that morning did he discover that no utility company, contractor, or estate representative had authorization to access the property. The report seemed minor at first, but it became the first entry in a file that would continue growing for nearly 2 months. 3 days later, another independent witness contacted the sheriff's office with an almost identical observation. A newspaper delivery driver passing the building before dawn reported seeing the front entrance standing partially open, while the same upstairs hallway appeared illuminated from within. Concerned that squatters or vandals had entered the vacant structure, deputies arrived less than 10 minutes after the call was received. They immediately discovered that every entrance remained locked exactly as documented during the previous inspection. Fresh snow covered the sidewalks and parking area, preserving every footprint with remarkable clarity. Investigators found only the tracks left by responding officers. No one had approached or departed the building since the snowfall had ended several hours earlier. Detectives requested permission from the estate representative to conduct a complete forensic inspection of the funeral home. Crime scene technicians photographed every office, hallway, chapel, basement, storage room, and preparation area before collecting fingerprints from doors, windows, stair railings, and interior surfaces. Thick dust covered nearly every floor, interrupted only by animal tracks near a broken basement window. The upstairs hallway, identified by witnesses, contained no functioning light fixtures, no temporary electrical equipment, and no indication that anyone had recently occupied the building. Electrical panels confirmed that the structure had received no commercial power since the previous year. Everything suggested the witnesses had simply mistaken reflections or distant vehicle lights for activity inside the abandoned property. Less than 1 week later, that theory began falling apart. A telecommunications contractor performing routine inspections across the street noticed movement behind an upstairs frosted glass door while sitting inside his service truck. His dashboard camera happened to be recording continuously. When detectives reviewed the footage, they observed a faint silhouette moving slowly across the upper hallway before disappearing from view. The recording lasted only several seconds and lacked sufficient detail to identify what had created the image. Analysts considered reflections from passing traffic, changing sunlight, and defects within the camera lens, but none successfully reproduced the same movement captured that morning. Concerned that someone might be entering the building through an undiscovered access point, investigators installed motion-activated cameras around every exterior entrance while placing additional recording equipment inside the main hallway and staircase. The surveillance system operated continuously for 28 days. During that period, cameras documented heavy snowfall, freezing rain, wildlife, maintenance inspections, and changing weather conditions. Not once did they record an unauthorized person entering or leaving the building. Despite that, dispatch continued receiving occasional reports from motorists, delivery drivers, and nearby residents describing lights appearing inside the second-floor hallway shortly before sunrise. Every reported sighting was carefully compared against surveillance footage collected during the exact same time period. The comparison consistently produced the same result. Exterior cameras showed dark windows. Interior cameras showed empty hallways. Witnesses insisted they had watched illuminated rooms for several minutes. Believing the explanation might involve unusual optical conditions, the sheriff requested assistance from engineers specializing in structural lighting and environmental reflections. Over multiple evenings, investigators recreated traffic patterns, positioned vehicles at different elevations, measured reflective angles from surrounding snowbanks, and tested portable lighting under various weather conditions. Hundreds of photographs were collected while every experiment was carefully documented. Although several reflections could briefly resemble interior lighting from certain viewpoints, none matched the color, duration, brightness, or precise location consistently reported by independent witnesses throughout the investigation. Engineers ultimately concluded that environmental reflections alone could not fully explain the repeated observations. As investigators searched deeper into county archives, they uncovered maintenance records dating back more than 20 years. During a renovation project completed in the late 1990s, local police had responded twice after neighboring business owners reported unexplained lights inside the funeral home after construction crews had already left for the evening. Those earlier reports attracted little attention because workers had occupied the building throughout the renovation period. However, work logs later confirmed that both incidents occurred on nights when no employees remained inside after sunset. Although the information added historical context, it provided no practical explanation for the current investigation. By early spring, structural engineers determined that years of water damage had rendered portions of the building unsafe. The property was eventually sold to a local developer who completely renovated the structure into professional office space. During construction, contractors removed walls, replaced electrical wiring, reinforced flooring, and inspected every hidden cavity throughout the building. No concealed rooms, unauthorized electrical systems, hidden entrances, or evidence of long-term occupation were ever discovered. Once renovation was completed and businesses moved into the building, reports of unexplained lights immediately stopped and have never been reported again. Today, the original investigative file remains preserved inside the county archives as an unresolved, suspicious incident rather than a criminal case. Detectives involved have consistently avoided describing the events as supernatural because no evidence supported that conclusion. Instead, they continue pointing to a much simpler reality. Independent witnesses repeatedly reported the same unusual observations over several weeks. Every report was investigated using available forensic methods. Cameras failed to confirm the sightings while simultaneously failing to explain them. Engineers eliminated every ordinary lighting scenario they could reproduce. Renovation crews found nothing capable of accounting for the repeated reports. In the end, the mystery was never defined by stories of ghosts or haunted buildings. It was defined by documented evidence that refused to fit any explanation investigators could prove, making it one of the most quietly unsettling cases ever preserved inside the mountains of West Virginia. In this news story, most ghost stories are impossible to verify because they survive only through rumor, family tradition, or stories repeated over generations. Investigators rarely pay attention to those accounts because they usually contain little evidence beyond personal belief. Every so often, however, an incident emerges that attracts the attention of law enforcement, emergency responders, and independent witnesses at the same time. Those cases are remembered not because anyone proved the existence of ghosts, but because every documented fact resisted ordinary explanation. One of the most discussed incidents of that kind began during the autumn of 2016 inside an abandoned elementary school hidden among the hills of eastern Kentucky. What started as a routine trespassing complaint eventually became a case that local investigators still remember years later. The Red Hollow Elementary School had been closed for nearly 14 years after declining enrollment forced the district to consolidate several rural campuses. Since then, the building had remained empty while ownership slowly transferred between county agencies. Electricity, water, and heating systems had all been disconnected, leaving the school exposed to years of harsh Appalachian winters. Although occasional vandals broke windows or painted graffiti inside the gymnasium, deputies rarely considered the property a significant concern. The building sat nearly 2 miles from the nearest occupied home, hidden behind thick woods that discouraged casual visitors. Most local residents eventually forgot the school still existed until several unrelated reports began arriving within the same month. The first report came from 2 utility contractors inspecting damaged telephone lines after a powerful windstorm. While driving past the abandoned school shortly after sunrise, both men noticed lights glowing inside what had once been the second-floor library. Assuming renovation crews had entered the building without notifying the utility company, they continued their inspection before mentioning the observation to county dispatch later that afternoon. Records immediately confirmed that no maintenance work had been scheduled anywhere on the property. Deputies briefly inspected the exterior before finding every entrance secured with rusted chains, exactly as documented during the previous county inspection only 3 weeks earlier. Several nights later, the County Volunteer Fire Department received an emergency call reporting possible smoke coming from the school roof. Firefighters arrived expecting an electrical fire despite knowing the building had no active power service. Upon reaching the property, they discovered no flames, no smoke, and no heat anywhere inside the structure. Thermal imaging cameras detected only normal temperature differences caused by cooling, concrete, and broken windows exposed to the night air. Before leaving, however, one firefighter quietly mentioned noticing what appeared to be movement at the far end of an upstairs hallway while searching the building. Other crew members dismissed the observation as shifting flashlight reflections, and the incident received little additional attention. The investigation changed during the second week of October when a deputy sheriff conducting routine patrol noticed something unusual while driving along the county highway below the hillside. Through gaps in the trees, he briefly observed several classroom windows reflecting a warm yellow glow, unlike ordinary sunrise or vehicle headlights. Curious, after hearing earlier reports, he drove directly to the property. By the time he reached the parking lot, less than 4 minutes later, every window had returned to complete darkness. The deputy searched the entire building alone before requesting additional officers. Dust covered every classroom floor, fallen ceiling tiles blocked several hallways, and years of accumulated debris remained completely undisturbed. There was no indication that another person had entered the school. Because multiple independent witnesses had now reported similar observations, detectives requested permission to install surveillance equipment throughout the building. Motion-activated cameras monitored every exterior entrance, while additional units covered the central staircase, library, gymnasium, and second-floor hallway where unusual activity had reportedly been observed. Audio recorders capable of operating continuously for several weeks were also placed inside the building to capture any sounds occurring overnight. Investigators expected the equipment to identify trespassers within days. Instead, nearly a month of recordings produced an entirely different puzzle. No unauthorized person was ever recorded entering or leaving the school. Even so, dispatch continued receiving occasional reports describing lights visible inside upper classroom windows before dawn. When technicians reviewed the surveillance recordings, they found nothing unusual on the video itself. Hallways remained empty, classrooms stayed dark, and exterior cameras showed no activity beyond wildlife crossing the parking lot. The audio recordings, however, attracted immediate attention. On 5 separate nights, microphones placed inside different sections of the school simultaneously captured faint sounds resembling lockers closing somewhere along the second-floor corridor. The sounds lasted only a few seconds before complete silence returned. Structural engineers later analyzed the recordings, suggesting that cooling metal pipes, loose ventilation ducts, or settling roof supports might produce similar noises. Yet none of those explanations accounted for the remarkable consistency in timing and location across every recording. Seeking a practical explanation, investigators invited engineers specializing in abandoned structures to examine the school from foundation to roof. Every electrical conduit, maintenance tunnel, attic space, and basement storage room was carefully inspected. Specialists searched for hidden occupants, illegal electrical connections, battery-powered lighting, or evidence that someone had secretly lived inside the building. They discovered nothing beyond expected storm damage and years of gradual deterioration. Even the upstairs library, where witnesses consistently reported seeing lights, contained only empty shelves, broken furniture, and shattered windows overlooking the surrounding forest. No hidden equipment capable of producing the reported glow was ever found. As detectives expanded their investigation, county archives revealed something unexpected. Maintenance records from the early 1980s documented several complaints filed by evening custodians describing unexplained lights appearing inside empty classrooms after electrical circuits had been switched off during renovation work. At the time, supervisors concluded faulty wiring probably caused the reports, although electricians later found no defects requiring repair. The records contained only brief references and were forgotten for decades until investigators compared them with the current witness statements. Although separated by more than 30 years, both groups consistently identified the same section of the second floor overlooking the eastern hillside. The school remained under periodic observation throughout the winter, but reports gradually became less frequent before stopping altogether after the county approved demolition the following summer. Contractors dismantled the aging structure over several weeks while investigators remained on site, hoping demolition might expose concealed rooms, hidden access points, or forgotten electrical equipment overlooked during previous inspections. None was discovered. Once the final walls disappeared and the property was cleared, every report connected to the abandoned school came to an end. No similar observations have been documented there since. Today, the official investigation remains archived as an unresolved suspicious incident rather than a criminal case. Detectives involved have repeatedly emphasized that nothing uncovered during the inquiry proved the presence of ghosts or any other supernatural cause. Nevertheless, they also acknowledge that several important questions remain unanswered. Independent witnesses reported nearly identical observations without knowing one another. Emergency responders personally experienced unusual events while searching the building. Surveillance equipment failed to identify trespassers despite weeks of monitoring. Engineers eliminated every practical explanation they could reproduce. In the end, the case became memorable not because anyone proved a haunting had occurred, but because every reasonable explanation quietly disappeared long before the questions did. For those who worked the investigation, it remains one of the true ghost encounters that no one involved has ever completely forgotten. In this new story. On August 9th, 2022, the Tennessee Highway Patrol opened an investigation after receiving three unrelated reports involving the same stretch of U.S. play. Highway 421 near the Tennessee-Virginia border. None of the callers reported a collision, a disabled vehicle, or a crime in progress. Instead, each described encountering a dark-colored pickup truck parked along the shoulder shortly after midnight with its headlights switched off. What immediately caught investigators' attention was that every witness provided nearly identical details despite contacting dispatch separately over a period of 45 minutes. By the time the first trooper reached the reported location, the truck had disappeared. At first, investigators assumed the driver had simply continued down the highway. Over the following week, however, evidence began suggesting that the three motorists had not witnessed the same event at all, despite believing they had. The investigation centered on a remote section of highway crossing steep Appalachian ridges where cellular reception frequently disappeared for several miles at a time. Although the road remained well-maintained, long curves and heavy tree cover limited visibility after sunset. Traffic volume dropped significantly after 11 o'clock, leaving many drivers traveling alone for extended periods. Highway patrol records showed relatively few serious accidents in the area, making the cluster of nearly identical reports stand out immediately. Detectives began by locating the three motorists, all of whom agreed to provide detailed written statements before learning anything about the other reports. The first witness, a traveling nurse returning home after a weekend shift, reported passing the parked pickup at approximately 12:18 a.m. She noticed the vehicle because it appeared unusually clean for a truck sitting partially on the gravel shoulder. According to her statement, the driver's door remained closed, no interior lights were visible, and no emergency flashers had been activated. Believing the driver might need assistance, she slowed briefly before deciding not to stop because she could see no one outside the vehicle. She continued driving without giving the incident further thought until hearing about the investigation several days later. 17 minutes later, a commercial delivery driver contacted emergency dispatch after observing what he believed was the same pickup approximately 3 miles farther north. Unlike the previous witness, he recalled seeing the driver's side door standing open while the headlights remained off. He reduced speed, expecting someone to emerge from the darkness beside the road, yet no movement appeared anywhere near the truck. Dashboard camera footage from his vehicle confirmed that a pickup had indeed been parked on the shoulder, but the grainy nighttime recording failed to capture enough detail for investigators to identify the license plate or determine whether anyone had been nearby. The third report arrived shortly before 1 o'clock from a retired firefighter driving toward Bristol after visiting relatives. His description matched the previous witnesses in almost every respect except for one important detail. He insisted the pickup had been parked facing the opposite direction from normal traffic flow. Initially, investigators believed the witness had simply become disoriented while driving through the mountain curves after midnight. Accident reconstruction specialists later visited the location and determined that his description of the vehicle's orientation accurately matched physical tire marks discovered beside the highway later that morning. Troopers searched the entire section of highway before sunrise without locating the pickup. Instead, investigators found fresh tire impressions leading from the shoulder toward an abandoned gravel access road that had once served a nearby communications tower. The road ended less than half a mile later at a locked security gate overlooking a steep ravine. Officers found no vehicle beyond the gate and no evidence suggesting a truck had turned around within the narrow clearing. Drone surveys conducted after daylight confirmed there were no alternative exits, hidden trails, or recent signs of off-road travel capable of explaining where the pickup had gone. Detectives next examined surveillance footage collected from service stations, convenience stores, and highway cameras covering every possible route leading toward the reported location. Investigators expected to identify the pickup entering or leaving the area within a predictable time frame. Instead, analysts discovered that no camera captured a vehicle matching the witnesses' descriptions after approximately 11:40 p.m. before the first emergency call. Every highway connecting to the remote section had at least one functioning traffic camera, yet none recorded a dark-colored pickup during the period in question. The absence of digital evidence became one of the most difficult aspects of the investigation because it conflicted directly with three independent witness accounts and partial dashboard camera footage. Forensic specialists inspected the tire impressions recovered from the gravel shoulder. Measurements indicated a full-size pickup equipped with all-terrain tires, but the tracks ended abruptly where the gravel access road met exposed bedrock near the communications site. Search teams expanded their examination well beyond the immediate area, covering wooded slopes, drainage channels, and abandoned maintenance roads. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging searched throughout the following night, while officers checked nearby storage buildings and isolated cabins. No vehicle matching the descriptions was ever located. Investigators ultimately concluded that the tire impressions confirmed a truck had reached the access road, but offered no evidence explaining how it had left. Several months later, analysts completed a synchronized reconstruction using dispatch logs, vehicle telematics from the delivery truck, dashboard camera timestamps, and the responding trooper's GPS records. The reconstruction revealed an unexpected inconsistency. Based on verified travel times, the three motorists could not all have observed the same pickup. According to the timeline, the vehicle would have needed to travel between reported locations faster than physically possible without passing one of the witnesses who had been continuously driving the highway. Investigators carefully reviewed every timestamp multiple times before accepting the conclusion. The reports remained individually credible, yet together they described movements that could not be reconciled. The case was eventually closed after detectives exhausted every investigative lead. No missing vehicles matching the available description were reported anywhere in Tennessee or Virginia during the relevant period. No abandoned pickup was recovered in surrounding counties, and no evidence suggested that the motorists had coordinated their accounts before contacting authorities. The official report classified the incident as an unresolved suspicious circumstance rather than a criminal investigation, noting that insufficient evidence existed to identify either the vehicle or its driver. Among Highway Patrol investigators, however, the case continues to circulate during training discussions because it demonstrates how multiple reliable witness statements can sometimes reinforce one another while simultaneously making a case far more difficult to explain. For travelers who regularly drive isolated Appalachian highways after midnight, it remains one of those investigations where every documented fact appears trustworthy, yet the complete story still refuses to fit together. In this new story, for most Americans, hitchhiking belongs to another era. During the 1960s, 70s, and even into the early 80s, it was common to see travelers standing beside rural highways carrying backpacks, duffel bags, or cardboard signs listing their destinations. Today, the practice has nearly disappeared, replaced by smartphones, ride-sharing apps, and growing concerns about personal safety. Yet, across Appalachia, where isolated roads still connect hundreds of small communities, sheriff departments continue receiving occasional reports involving hitchhikers whose stories leave investigators with more questions than answers. Some reports involve stranded travelers. Others involve motorists who later insisted they picked up someone who seemed perfectly ordinary until the journey took an unexpected turn. The following case remains one of the strangest ever documented along the back roads of eastern Kentucky. During the final week of October 2017, 49-year-old Daniel Brooks left Pikeville, Kentucky, shortly after sunset following a routine maintenance inspection at a communications tower. Daniel had worked as a field technician for nearly 20 years and often drove remote mountain roads long after dark. Friends described him as practical, patient, and difficult to rattle. His truck contained emergency supplies, extra fuel, recovery equipment, and printed county maps in case his navigation system failed. He had traveled nearly every road in eastern Kentucky and believed there were very few surprises left in the Appalachian Mountains. Around 8:45 that evening, Daniel entered Kentucky Route 80 while taking a shortcut toward Prestonsburg. Traffic was unusually light. During nearly 30 minutes of driving, he encountered only two other vehicles. Autumn leaves covered the shoulders, while patches of low fog settled inside narrow valleys below the highway. The temperature had fallen into the upper 30s, making it unlikely anyone would be walking along such an isolated road. That assumption changed when Daniel rounded a sharp curve and saw a man standing beside an old wooden guardrail illuminated by his headlights. The stranger appeared to be in his late 60s. He wore a faded brown jacket, denim overalls, and carried a small canvas bag over one shoulder. He did not wave frantically or step into the roadway. Instead, he simply raised one hand as Daniel approached. Years working throughout rural Appalachia had taught Daniel that helping stranded travelers was still common in many mountain communities. He slowed, unlocked the passenger door, and asked where the man was headed. The stranger smiled politely before answering, just a little farther down the road. His voice was calm, almost reassuring, with the slow Appalachian accent Daniel had heard throughout his childhood. As they continued driving, the conversation remained surprisingly ordinary. The man introduced himself only as Walter and claimed he had been visiting relatives in a nearby hollow after attending a funeral earlier that afternoon. He spoke about abandoned coal camps, old churches disappearing from the mountains, and how many young people had moved away searching for work. Nothing about the discussion seemed unusual. Daniel later told investigators that Walter sounded exactly like dozens of older residents he had met during years working throughout eastern Kentucky. If anything, he seemed grateful simply to have someone willing to talk during a lonely drive through the mountains. After nearly 15 minutes, Walter pointed toward a narrow gravel road branching away from the highway. There were no reflective signs, no visible houses, and no mailbox identifying the road. Daniel slowed before asking whether anyone actually lived there. Walter quietly nodded and replied, "Used to be a whole community." The answer struck Daniel as oddly phrased. Before he could ask another question, Walter looked toward the dark forest beyond the windshield and added, "Most folks don't stop around here anymore, probably for the best." Daniel offered to drive him farther down the gravel road, but Walter immediately declined. Instead, he asked to be dropped off exactly where the pavement ended. Daniel stopped beside a rusted cattle gate partially hidden beneath vines. Walter thanked him, stepped from the truck, and walked slowly into the darkness carrying the same small canvas bag. Daniel watched through the side mirror until the man disappeared beyond the gate. Satisfied that his passenger had reached home safely, he continued toward Prestonsburg. Less than 5 minutes later, his truck radio suddenly filled with heavy static before clearing on its own. He thought little of it until reaching home later that evening. The following weekend, Daniel mentioned the encounter while working with another technician who had lived in the area his entire life. When he described dropping an older man named Walter near the abandoned gravel road, his coworker became unusually quiet. After several moments, he asked Daniel whether the man had been wearing brown overalls and carrying a faded canvas bag. Daniel answered yes without hesitation. His coworker then explained that the description matched Walter Hensley, a retired coal miner who had died from a heart attack nearly 12 years earlier. At first, Daniel laughed, assuming someone else shared the same name. His coworker insisted there had never been another Walter Hensley living in that hollow. Curiosity eventually led Daniel to the Floyd County Historical Society, where volunteers maintained newspaper archives and cemetery records. They located Walter Hensley's obituary from November 2005. The accompanying photograph showed an older man wearing denim overalls and smiling exactly as Daniel remembered. Even the canvas bag hanging from Walter's shoulder appeared in one family photograph donated decades earlier. According to surviving relatives, the abandoned gravel road once led to a small mining settlement completely abandoned after flooding during the early 1990s. Today, little remained except broken foundations hidden beneath the forest. No permanent residents had lived there for years. Daniel never claimed he had encountered anything supernatural. During interviews, he consistently stated that he believed he had given a ride to a real person, someone with a normal voice, ordinary conversation, and detailed knowledge of the surrounding communities. Yet investigators could not explain how Walter disappeared so quickly after leaving the truck, why no other residents matched the description, or why Daniel accurately described personal details never mentioned until he later viewed the archived obituary. The sheriff's office found no evidence of criminal activity and officially closed the inquiry without further action. Stories like Daniel's continue circulating throughout Appalachia, often dismissed as misunderstandings, mistaken identity, or memories shaped by lonely mountain roads after dark. Most likely, there are perfectly reasonable explanations for every detail. Even so, experienced deputies, volunteer firefighters, and lifelong residents quietly share one piece of advice with newcomers exploring the back roads at night. If you decide to stop for a hitchhiker, pay close attention to where they ask you to let them out. Because sometimes the destination is no longer there, and sometimes the person thanking you for the ride has already been part of Appalachian history for many years. In this new story, true creepy and scary horror stories from the Appalachian Mountains. In the autumn of 2021, a 24-year-old hiker named Elias Thorne, who worked as a land surveyor, entered the dense timber of the Monongahela National Forest for a weekend trek. He intended to document seasonal soil erosion patterns along the high ridges near the West Virginia border while testing new GPS equipment in deep terrain. Local dispatch logs from that evening indicate that the weather turned abruptly and a thick fog settled over the limestone valleys without any prior warning. Elias was a seasoned outdoorsman who understood the risks of the Appalachian landscape, but he reportedly failed to check in with his emergency contact. Investigators never confirmed if he strayed from the marked path or if the shifting weather conditions simply obscured the familiar landmarks of the trail. According to archive notes from the regional search team, Elias began to experience a series of equipment failures as he reached the higher elevations. The GPS unit displayed conflicting coordinates that suggested he was moving south, while his compass indicated a steady northern heading toward the primary base camp. He eventually decided to set up a temporary shelter near a rocky outcropping because the visibility had dropped to less than 10 feet. State records indicate that several other hikers in the vicinity reported hearing repetitive metallic sounds echoing through the trees during the late hours of the night. Some locals claimed that the sounds were merely the result of wind moving through abandoned mining shafts, but the county file from 2009 suggests otherwise. Elias woke up during the early morning hours to find that his heavy hiking boots had been moved precisely 3 feet away from his tent. There were no footprints in the soft mud surrounding his campsite, and the internal zipper of his tent was still locked from the previous night. He gathered his belongings in total silence while observing that the surrounding forest had become unnaturally quiet, as if the local wildlife had fled. Records conflict regarding the exact path he took to exit the forest, but Elias later stated that he felt a constant presence just behind him. The investigation concluded without finding any evidence of another person in the area, and the case remains a point of ambiguity for the local authorities. The state records from 2022 mention a second individual named Sarah Miller, who was a 32-year-old biologist studying local bat populations. Sarah was stationed in a remote cabin near the Clinch Mountain Range, where she spent several weeks collecting data on nocturnal migratory patterns. Her logs mention that she discovered several strange markings carved into the trees surrounding her research site during the first week of her stay. She reportedly captured several audio recordings of a voice that seemed to mimic her own vocal patterns from the previous evening. Investigators never confirmed the source of the audio, but the archived notes suggest that Sarah became increasingly paranoid about her immediate surroundings. County files from 2015 describe an incident involving a park ranger named Marcus Reed, who was 45 years old at the time. Marcus was tasked with patrolling the northern boundaries of the Great Smoky Mountains, where several campers had reported seeing flickering lights in the distance. He arrived at a clearing near a decommissioned fire tower and discovered a collection of personal items neatly arranged in a circular pattern. The items included a digital watch and a pair of spectacles that appeared to belong to a missing person from 2012. Dispatch logs indicate that Marcus requested immediate backup after hearing a heavy breathing sound coming from the darkness just beyond his flashlight beam. Some locals claimed that the fire tower was the site of a forgotten settlement, but official state records show no evidence of any historical structures. Marcus reported that he saw a tall figure standing perfectly still near the base of the tower, but the figure vanished when he approached. The county file from 2009 mentions a similar encounter involving a group of hunters who were tracking deer in the same region. These men reportedly abandoned their equipment and fled the area after witnessing a series of blue flashes emanating from the forest floor. Investigators never confirmed the cause of the flashes, and the terrain was later declared off-limits for several months following the incident. A third individual, named James Bennett, was a 50-year-old retired police officer who enjoyed solo camping trips in the Blue Ridge Mountains. In the spring of 2016, he planned a 5-day excursion through a section of the forest known for its treacherous slopes. James was equipped with a high-frequency radio and a detailed map of the region that he had used for over 20 years. Archived notes indicate that he sent a brief transmission on the second night, stating that he had found an unmarked cave entrance. The transmission ended abruptly with a sharp static noise that the dispatch center was unable to filter or identify using standard equipment. Search teams arrived at the coordinates of the cave entrance only to find that the opening had been blocked by a massive rockfall. They discovered James's radio sitting on top of a flat stone, but there was no sign of a struggle or any physical tracks. Records conflict about whether the rockfall was a natural occurrence or if it had been triggered by an external force during the night. Some locals claimed to hear a muffled tapping sound coming from behind the rocks, but the sound was never captured on official recording devices. The state records from 2017 officially closed the case as a tragic accident involving an unforeseen geological event in a remote area. Investigators later discovered a series of photographs on James's camera that depicted a dark corridor lined with what appeared to be rusted metal doors. The photographs were blurry, and the light source was insufficient to provide a clear view of what lay beyond the threshold of the cave. Dispatch logs from that period show that several unauthorized individuals attempted to access the site before it was permanently sealed by the county. The county file from 2009 mentions a local legend about a hidden facility, but no evidence of such a place exists. James remains missing, and the true nature of the unmarked cave entrance continues to be a subject of intense local debate. In the winter of 2018, a 29-year-old geographer named Thomas Vance traveled to the rural outskirts of Kentucky. Thomas was employed by a private environmental firm to map the underground water tables and limestone aquifers hidden beneath the rugged hills. He reportedly established a base camp in a valley that local residents often avoided due to the frequent presence of heavy ground mist. State records from that month indicate that Thomas made several calls to his supervisor regarding anomalous readings on his seismic detection tools. The readings suggested that a large hollow space existed directly beneath his tent, but no known maps indicated any subterranean tunnels. According to dispatch logs, Thomas reported that the ground beneath his feet felt like it was vibrating rhythmically every night at 3 a.m. He decided to document the phenomenon using a high-sensitivity microphone and a series of motion sensors placed around the valley floor. Archived notes show that Thomas recorded a sound that resembled a low-frequency hum that caused structural damage to his electronic gear. Investigators never confirmed the source of the vibration, but the county file from 2009 mentions similar reports from local farmers. Thomas was found 3 days later wandering along a remote logging road in a state of deep confusion and physical exhaustion. He reportedly claimed that he had seen a series of vertical shafts hidden beneath the thick brush that were lined with smooth glass. The state records indicate that Thomas had lost all memory of how he had escaped the valley or where his equipment went. Search crews returned to the campsite, but they discovered that the entire area had been swept clean of any human presence. Even the flattened grass where his tent had stood was now standing upright as if no weight had ever been applied. Records conflict on whether Thomas suffered from a medical episode or if he had encountered an undocumented geographic feature in the hills. The Whispering Ridges of Blackwood Canyon. The eastern slopes of the mountain range remained largely unmapped during the late 19th century, attracting only the most resilient timber cruisers and surveyors. In the autumn of roughly 80 years ago, a team of 4 experienced land surveyors established a base camp in a deep, heavily forested valley known locally as Blackwood Canyon. Their objective was to plot the boundaries of a proposed timber reserve, a task requiring them to spend several weeks in total isolation from the nearest settlement. The environment was characterized by dense stands of old-growth Douglas fir, steep rocky terrain, and a silence so profound that the men initially remarked on the complete absence of typical forest sounds. By the 4th day of the expedition, the routine nature of their work began to shift, as a series of unexplained auditory sensations disrupted the camp. The men reported hearing what sounded like distant, rhythmic chanting that seemed to emanate directly from the stone walls of the canyon rather than from any distinct physical source. The lead surveyor, a veteran of wilderness campaigns named Thomas Albright, noted in his logs that the sounds did not align with any known wildlife or geological activity. The noises typically began just after sundown, starting as a low-frequency hum that vibrated through the ground before transitioning into distinct, modulated cadences resembling human speech. When the crew attempted to trace the sound, they found that its apparent direction shifted constantly, making it impossible to pinpoint an origin point. The younger members of the crew, including a transit operator named Edward Lynn, expressed growing discomfort, describing a sensation of intense pressure in their ears whenever the chanting commenced. Despite their unease, the team maintained their daily schedule, attributing the phenomenon to unusual wind currents passing through the narrow rock formations higher up the ridge. However, the lack of any significant wind during those chilly, still autumn nights quickly complicated that rationalization. As the first week drew to a close, the auditory disturbances escalated from distant hums to loud, distinct vocalizations that appeared to occur much closer to the perimeter of their camp. On the night of October 12th, all 4 men awoke simultaneously to the sound of a single, sustained note that seemed to vibrate the very canvas of their tents. Albright exited his tent with a lantern, but found nothing in the surrounding woods, except for a peculiar, localized mist that hung low to the ground despite a clear sky overhead. The camp dog, a large retriever known for its reliable tracking instincts, refused to leave the shelter of the supply wagon and spent the remaining hours of the night whimpering. The next morning, the crew discovered that their brass surveying instruments, which had been securely locked in wooden cases, were completely out of alignment, their delicate internal needles pointing wildly away from magnetic north. The psychological toll of the continuous, unexplained noise began to manifest in the behavior of the crew members, who reported experiencing vivid, recurring dreams of vast subterranean spaces. Lynn, in particular, became increasingly obsessed with the idea that the sounds were a form of communication, spending his evening hours sitting at the edge of the firelight, listening intently to the darkness. His journals from that week contained frantic attempts to transcribe the phonetic patterns of the chanting, resulting in pages of repetitive, nonsensical symbols that bore no resemblance to any known language. The other men attempted to dissuade him from his isolation, but a growing sense of irritability and mutual suspicion began to fracture the group dynamic. The shared perception of an unseen, listening presence in the valley created an atmosphere of pervasive dread that made sleep nearly impossible. By mid-October, the weather turned sharply colder, bringing heavy frost but no wind to explain the persistent acoustic phenomena. The team decided to accelerate their fieldwork in order to leave the canyon ahead of schedule, working longer hours in the rugged upper terrain. During these daytime excursions, the men began to experience sensory distortions, reporting that the forest appeared strangely flat and devoid of color, as if a thick veil had been drawn over the landscape. They also noted that their perception of time seemed heavily altered, with hours passing in what felt like mere moments, or conversely, a single afternoon stretching out into an agonizingly long ordeal. On several occasions, members of the party became momentarily separated in wide-open clearings, only to find themselves completely disoriented and unable to locate their companions who were standing less than 50 yards away. The peak incident occurred on the night of October 20th, during a period of total atmospheric stillness. The chanting, which had been absent during the day, returned with an unprecedented intensity that made conversation within the camp impossible without shouting. According to later accounts collected from the survivors, the sound did not seem to travel through the air, but rather originated from within their own skulls, creating an intense throbbing sensation behind their eyes. At approximately midnight, Lin abruptly stood up from his bed, walked past his companions without speaking, and strode directly into the unlit forest toward the steepest section of the canyon wall. Albright and the remaining crew grabbed lanterns and pursued him immediately, but the dense undergrowth and the overwhelming nature of the sound severely hindered their progress through the dark. They followed the sound of Lin crashing through the brush until they reached the base of a massive, sheer cliff face where the acoustic vibrations were so intense that the lantern glass began to shatter. Through the dim, flickering light of the remaining lanterns, the men observed Lin standing motionless against the rock, his head tilted back as if looking toward the summit. When Albright approached to pull him away, Lin turned around, exhibiting a state of profound shock, his eyes wide and completely unblinking. He insisted that the wall of rock was no longer solid, but rather a vast opening leading into a brightly lit space filled with moving figures. The other crew members saw only the solid gray expanse of limestone, but the discrepancy in their perceptions caused an immediate, panicked retreat back to the main camp. The following morning, the team abandoned the majority of their heavy equipment and began a rapid descent out of Blackwood Canyon, determined to reach the nearest logging outpost. Lin remained in a catatonic state during the entire trek, requiring physical assistance to walk and showing no awareness of his surroundings. The remaining 3 men were plagued by a persistent ringing in their ears and a deep physical exhaustion that did not subside even after they exited the valley. Upon reaching safety, the surveyors underwent medical evaluations where doctors noted that all 4 men exhibited symptoms typically associated with extreme prolonged exposure to low-frequency vibrations, including inner ear damage and severe cognitive disorientation. An official investigation into the incident was launched by the Regional Surveying Office, primarily to recover the expensive abandoned equipment and to verify the claims made by the crew. A secondary team of surveyors, accompanied by 2 local law enforcement officers, entered Blackwood Canyon 3 weeks after the original party had fled. They located the base camp intact, though they noted that the surrounding vegetation showed unusual signs of localized desiccation, with leaves and pine needles scorched as if subjected to intense heat, despite no evidence of an actual fire. The brass instruments were recovered from their boxes, but examiners later determined that their metal components had become permanently demagnetized, rendering them completely useless for future geographic work. The second expedition experienced none of the acoustic phenomena reported by Albright's crew, finding the valley to be entirely quiet and unremarkable. They concluded that the original team had likely suffered from a form of collective hysteria brought on by the extreme isolation, poor rations, and the deceptive echoes common to narrow, rocky canyons. This environmental explanation, however, failed to satisfy the men who had lived through the experience, particularly given the permanent physical changes they suffered. Lin never fully recovered his faculties and spent the remainder of his life in a private sanitarium, where he continued to insist until his death that a part of his mind had remained behind inside the stone walls of the ridge. The case of Blackwood Canyon was eventually archived in regional historical records as a curious footnote in the mapping of the territory, largely forgotten by the public. Modern researchers who have examined the surviving logs and medical reports suggest that the valley may possess unique geological features capable of producing infrasound, which can cause hallucinations, anxiety, and physiological distress in humans. Others point to the possibility of localized pocket emissions of natural gases that could distort perception and cause collective neurological symptoms. To this day, the exact nature of what the surveyors encountered in that isolated valley remains unresolved, leaving behind only the eerie, unsettling testimonies of the men who heard the ridge's whisper. The lingering questions surrounding the event continued to discourage further development in Blackwood Canyon for decades after the survey team's disastrous expedition. Local logging companies found that workers were highly reluctant to enter the valley, citing the old stories of the chanting and the psychological breakdown of the surveyors. Even when high-quality timber became scarce in adjacent areas, the canyon remained untouched, preserved by a reputation that time did not seem to dim. The few independent trappers who ventured near the perimeter of the valley in the early 20th century reported that the local wildlife appeared to avoid the deep interior of the canyon, preferring the more open, less oppressive terrain of the outer slopes. In the late 1950s, a university geology department attempted to conduct a comprehensive acoustic survey of the region to either confirm or disprove the infrasound hypothesis permanently. The researchers set up highly sensitive recording devices at various elevations along the canyon walls, hoping to capture any low-frequency vibrations generated by the unique rock formations. During their 2-week stay, the instruments recorded several instances of unusual seismic microtremors, but no significant acoustic anomalies were detected that matched the descriptions in Albright's journals. The study concluded that while the canyon's shape could theoretically amplify certain sounds, there was no contemporary evidence of any ongoing, unexplained phenomena active in the area. Despite the scientific community's skepticism, the private papers of Thomas Albright, which were donated to a regional historical society by his descendants, offer a much more personal and unsettling view of the aftermath. In his later years, Albright became a recluse, refusing to travel anywhere near mountainous terrain and keeping his home illuminated at all times of the night. His personal diaries reveal that he remained convinced until his final days that the phenomenon they encountered was not a product of the wind or gas, but something inherent to the location itself. He wrote extensively about the difficulty of adjusting to normal life when the memory of that absolute vibrating silence continued to echo in his mind, undermining his confidence in the physical world. The story of the Blackwood Canyon incident survives today primarily within the specialized archives of regional folklore and historical geography societies, away from mainstream media attention. It serves as a stark reminder of the limits of early exploration and the profound psychological effects that the deep wilderness can inflict on those who attempt to measure it. The unresolved discrepancy between the physical evidence of damaged equipment and the subjective horror experienced by the surveyors ensures that the valley retains its enigmatic status. Whether the events were caused by an undiscovered natural mechanism or a temporary distortion of human perception, The canyon remains a place where the boundary between reality and the unexplained became terrifyingly thin for four forgotten men. In this new story, terrifying true encounters from the deep Appalachian Mountains. In 2013, 24-year-old park ranger Elias Thorne was stationed in a remote sector of the Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia. His primary objective involved surveying trail erosion following a series of heavy storms that had compromised the structural integrity of the local ridgelines. Thorne was an experienced outdoorsman who possessed a deep understanding of the regional topography and the inherent risks associated with isolated mountain navigation. Reportedly, he had completed hundreds of similar solo patrols without incident during his 3-year tenure with the Forestry Department. However, county files from 2013 indicate that his final scheduled check-in never reached the regional dispatch center that evening. The initial search efforts commenced within 6 hours of the missed radio contact as local authorities followed the documented route left in the official logs. State records indicate that search parties found Thorne's abandoned utility vehicle parked at a designated trailhead with his personal gear still inside the cabin. Some investigators noted that the driver's side door remained wide open despite the approaching cold front and the significant drop in ambient temperature. Archived notes from the primary search coordinator describe a scene where there were no signs of a struggle or any forced entry. Dispatch logs from that night confirm that a heavy fog rolled through the valley, which significantly hindered the visibility for the ground teams. By the morning of the second day, a group of local volunteers claimed they discovered a series of unusual depressions in the soft mud. Investigators never confirmed if these markings were of human origin or simply the result of natural erosion occurring near the creek bed. State records show that the tracks led toward a steep limestone cavern system that was not marked on any of the modern geological maps. According to several archived notes from the period, the cave entrance appeared to have been recently disturbed by something of significant physical mass. The team found a single torn piece of a standard forestry uniform snagged on a sharp rock fragment deep within the dark passage. A secondary forensic team arrived on site to examine the evidence, but they found that the subterranean environment was too unstable for a full descent. Records conflict regarding the exact depth of the shaft and whether the sounds reported by the volunteers were echoes or something more tangible. Some locals claimed they heard a rhythmic metallic scraping emanating from the limestone depths during the quiet hours of the early morning search. County files from 2013 reflect that no animal known to the region would produce a sound matching the descriptions provided by those witnesses. The official investigation eventually stalled due to the lack of physical remains and the increasingly hazardous conditions inside the crumbling cavern system. As the weeks passed into 2014, search teams expanded their radius to include the higher elevation ridges located several miles from the vehicle. Records from the county sheriff department indicate that a second-person 29-year-old surveyor named Sarah Miller also went missing nearby. Miller was reportedly working on a private land assessment project when her equipment was found neatly stacked on a granite boulder. State records show that her GPS unit had been placed on top of the stack and was still powered on when found. Investigators never confirmed why she would abandon her high-value tools in the middle of a shift during broad daylight. Archive notes from the Miller case file describe a series of inconsistent witness accounts regarding her movements on the day she vanished. Some locals claimed they saw a figure matching her description walking toward the high peaks without any of her necessary safety gear. Dispatch logs from that afternoon do not record any distress signals or calls for assistance from her assigned mobile radio unit. State records indicate that the search for Miller was eventually merged with the ongoing investigation into the disappearance of Elias Thorne. Authorities noted that both individuals were last seen within a 5-mile radius of the same unmapped limestone cavern system. During the summer of 2014, a team of specialized cave divers attempted to explore the flooded lower chambers of the mountain range. County files from 2014 suggest that the divers discovered a series of narrow tunnels that showed evidence of human occupation. Archive notes describe the presence of several rusted tools and fragments of clothing that appeared to date back several decades. Investigators never confirmed if these items belonged to recent missing persons or to workers from an abandoned mining operation. Records conflict about whether the tunnel system connects to the surface at any point other than the main limestone entrance. One diver reportedly claimed that he saw a series of deliberate markings etched into the stone walls deep beneath the waterline. These markings appeared to be a set of dates and initials, but the silt levels made it impossible to capture clear images. State records show that the diving operation was terminated early after 2 members of the team experienced unexplained equipment malfunctions. Dispatch logs indicate that both divers reported a sudden and total loss of their primary lighting systems simultaneously while in separate chambers. No technical reason for the double failure was ever identified by the equipment manufacturers during the subsequent forensic review. 14 months later, a pair of hikers in a neighboring county located a rusted handheld radio resting on a high rocky ledge. State records verify that the serial number on the device matched the unit issued to Thorne before his disappearance. The ledge was located over 12 miles away from the original search area and required a level of climbing skill Thorne did not possess. Investigators found that the battery had been removed and the internal components were completely corroded by long-term exposure. There was no explanation for how the device reached such a remote and inaccessible location without the use of specialized gear is less than #. Zero hash is greater than. Historical data from the county archives mentions a similar series of unexplained disappearances that occurred in the same region in 1976. State records from that era describe a group of 4 experienced backpackers who vanished while navigating the Monongahela forest ridgelines. According to archive notes, the only evidence found was a single tent that had been sliced open from the inside. Investigators never confirmed if the cuts were made by a tool or by the jagged rocks surrounding the campsite. Some locals claimed that the hikers had wandered into an area known for magnetic anomalies that interfere with compass readings. Dispatch logs from 1976 indicate that search teams were forced to retreat due to a sudden and uncharacteristic seismic event. State records show that the ground tremors caused significant shifts in the local cave systems, which altered the landscape permanently. Archive notes from the time suggest that several previously known entrances were swallowed by the shifting limestone plates during the event. Investigators never confirmed if the missing backpackers were trapped in the lower chambers when the geological shift occurred. The files were eventually closed due to a lack of physical evidence or credible leads regarding their final coordinates. In 2015, a local rancher reported finding an old leather satchel partially buried in a dry creek bed near the mountain base. State records indicate that the satchel contained a set of handwritten journals belonging to an unknown individual from 2012. Archive notes from the forensic examination describe the entries as a series of meticulous observations regarding the movement of local wildlife. One specific entry reportedly mentions a large bipedal figure that the author observed watching the camp from the tree line. Investigators never confirmed the identity of the journal author or why the satchel was abandoned in such a precarious spot. The journals also contained a hand-drawn map of the limestone cavern system that featured several exits not found on modern maps. State records show that one of these exits was located near the ledge where Thorne's radio was discovered later. Some investigators questioned if a hidden network of tunnels allowed for rapid movement across the difficult mountain terrain without being detected. Dispatch logs from 2015 indicate that a brief follow-up search was conducted based on the coordinates in the journal. However, the teams found that the specific area mentioned had been covered by a massive rockfall following the 2013 storms. County files from 2016 detail a report of strange light patterns observed by commercial pilots flying over the Monongahela region. State records indicate that the lights appeared as a series of blue pulses originating from the deep mountain valleys. Investigators never confirmed the source of the illumination, although some suggested it was atmospheric phenomena common to high altitudes. Archive notes from the federal aviation logs show that the pulses did not correspond to any known ground-based signals. These reports coincided with another brief spike in local missing person cases that occurred during the same calendar month. The case of Elias Thorne and Sarah Miller remains open in the state records, although no new leads have surfaced recently. Dispatch logs from the original search are still categorized as incomplete because of the numerous reports that were never officially verified. Some locals claimed that the mountain terrain itself changes during heavy fog, making it nearly impossible for even experienced rangers to navigate. Archive notes from the lead investigator suggest that Thorne might have simply succumbed to the elements after becoming disoriented. However, the lack of a body and the strange placement of his equipment continue to fuel a sense of uncertainty. What happened in this Appalachian ghost town still terrifies locals today. A freezing rain began to fall over the remote coal valley of Cinder Creek on the 9th night of October 1982. Local dispatch logs later showed that 3 separate emergency calls were placed from the mountain community within a 10-minute window. Each caller reported hearing a low and rhythmic thumping sound that seemed to vibrate directly through their living room floors. State records from that weekend indicated that the state police sent 2 troopers to investigate the unusual disturbance. When the officers arrived at the valley entrance, they found a deserted highway and a town that was completely dark. The local authorities never found a definitive explanation for why an entire community abandoned their homes in a single hour. Gideon Vance was a 38-year-old timber cruiser who spent his days assessing hardwood forests in Western Virginia. He had lived near the mouth of Cinder Creek his entire life and knew the steep mountain paths by heart. On that particular dreary morning, his only goal was to evaluate a dense stand of white oak near the ridgeline. He packed his iron-marking axe and a worn leather field journal into the cab of his four-wheel drive truck. The morning air smelled strongly of wet coal dust and decaying leaves as he started his slow ascent up the mountain. He expected a routine day of measuring trunk diameters and noting boundary markers through the heavy mountain mist. By 4 in the afternoon, a dense and suffocating fog began to roll through the deep gaps in the mountain ridge. Gideon noticed that his pocket watch had stopped ticking entirely, which was highly unusual for a reliable mechanical timepiece. He packed his gear early and decided to walk back down toward the settlement before the mountain trail became treacherous. As he emerged from the tree line above the valley, he noticed that the entire town was shrouded in complete darkness. The streetlights were completely dead, and not a single window showed the warm glow of a lamp or a television screen. He quickened his pace down the gravel road to check on his neighbors at the local store. Gideon parked his truck outside the Cinder Creek General Store and walked up the creaking wooden steps to the front door. The air was deathly quiet, and the only sound was the steady dripping of rain from the rusted tin roof drainage. He pushed the door open and found the interior completely undisturbed, with the cash register drawer still closed tightly. A pot of fresh coffee was sitting on the cold burner, and several open ledgers were scattered across the counter. He shouted into the back storage room, but his voice only produced a faint echo against the unpainted wooden walls. He noticed that every single house along the main road had its front door swung wide open to the storm. County files from 1982 later revealed that the state troopers found 24 vehicles left parked in their driveways. Gideon walked into the small valley schoolhouse and discovered that the children had left their woolen coats hanging on the wall. A charcoal chalkboard in the main classroom still displayed a spelling lesson that was dated for that exact Monday morning. He discovered several domestic pets wandering aimlessly through the muddy alleys, but there was no sign of their owners anywhere. The entire settlement felt like an open grave where a vibrant community had suddenly vanished without a single cry. He drove to the neighboring county seat to report the massive and inexplicable abandonment to the state authorities. He spent the next 4 days working alongside state investigators who arrived to secure the eerie and silent perimeter. Gideon used his intimate knowledge of the timber tracks to help the search teams systematically comb the surrounding mountain ridges. They found no signs of violence, no broken windows, and absolutely no footprints leading into the dense laurel thickets. Witness statements from a nearby logging camp indicated that no vehicles had passed through the valley road since the previous evening. A state police investigator named Silas Vance found a bizarre detail inside the abandoned rail depot at the edge of town. Some locals from the next valley claimed that the ground had been trembling for days before the disappearance. Silas discovered a series of deep fractures in the earth that ran directly parallel to the old iron railroad tracks. Gideon helped the investigator measure the deep fissures, which emitted a faint and bitter odor that smelled like sulfur. They found dozens of abandoned flashlights and heavy miner helmets scattered around the entrance of an old ventilation shaft. The tracks inside the shaft led deep into abandoned coal workings that ran directly beneath the residential section of the town. Mining archives showed these particular tunnels had been closed down by the federal government back in 1965. Investigators never confirmed whether an illegal salvage operation had been active inside the dangerous and unmapped subterranean passages. The investigators recovered a waterlogged leather notebook from a metal locker inside the foreman office at the depot. Archived notes from a retired rail supervisor indicated that a massive underground pocket of methane gas had been expanding for months. The final handwritten entry described a sudden shift in the mountain bedrock that threatened to collapse the entire valley floor. The supervisor wrote that the air quality had dropped below safe levels and made an immediate evacuation absolutely necessary. They apparently fled into the deep mountain tunnels to escape the toxic fumes because the highway was blocked by a rock slide. Records conflict regarding whether the residents ever emerged from the complex network of interconnected cavern systems on the other side. The state authorities ultimately classified the valley as a permanent hazard zone and restricted all public entry with high fences. Gideon stood on the ridge months later and watched heavy machinery dump tons of gravel into the main valley entrance. The empty houses of Cinder Creek remained standing as rotting skeletons of a town that was swallowed by the mountain. Investigators closed the official file, but the true location of the residents remains a dark mystery among the regional population. The silent and overgrown valley is the only remaining reminder of the night an entire Appalachian community vanished into thin air. For 20 years, nobody entered this Appalachian cabin. Deep in the dense wilderness of the Appalachian Mountains, an abandoned cabin sat completely undisturbed for 2 decades. During the early spring of 2020, a determined property appraiser finally unlocked the heavy front door. What he discovered inside the dusty, rotting structure remains a highly debated topic among regional law enforcement today. Archive notes from the subsequent state police investigation describe a highly disturbing scene that defies simple logical explanation. 45-year-old Robert Hayes worked as a highly experienced municipal property appraiser for the rural county. His primary professional objective required him to evaluate abandoned, secluded estates for upcoming public tax auction property sales. The county file from 2009 mentioned a highly unstable structural foundation regarding this specific isolated property. He safely arrived on April 4th and immediately began carefully assessing the severely overgrown exterior of the structure. The first hour of his standard inspection passed entirely without any significant dangerous incidents or unexpected safety hazards. State records confirm the regional weather forecast predicted clear skies and moderate temperatures for that entire calm afternoon. However, Robert distinctly heard strange, heavy dragging sounds echoing slowly from the upper floor of the abandoned cabin. He initially assumed a large wild animal was aggressively building a nesting den inside the warm, dry attic. When he cautiously shouted a loud verbal warning, the heavy dragging sounds instantly ceased in the dusty darkness. Robert quickly discovered a highly bizarre set of massive, deep indentations on the original hardwood floor completely inside. The strange, unexplainable tracks were perfectly smooth in shape, and they pressed heavily into the solid oak planks. Some locals claimed a rogue drifter occasionally used the abandoned structure to hide stolen heavy commercial mining equipment. Investigators never confirmed those specific, wild, unsubstantiated rumors and firmly maintained the property was completely securely locked prior. Robert carefully photographed the bizarre, smooth floor damage and noted the stride length indicated a massive, heavy object. The highly stressful situation escalated drastically when an awful chemical smell suddenly arrived continuously throughout the entire floor. Reportedly, the foul, suffocating odor tightly resembled burning synthetic plastic, mixed heavily with the sharp scent of sulfur. The dedicated appraiser immediately started coughing violently and aggressively struggling to breathe properly inside the completely sealed room. Robert quickly grabbed his portable emergency radio to call for immediate outside medical assistance, but only received static. Dispatch logs show no emergency distress calls were ever successfully officially recorded by the regional sheriff that day. Suddenly, a massive, unseen, heavy physical force violently shook the solid foundation and partially collapsed the wooden staircase. Robert scrambled frantically toward the dark open hallway and desperately aimed his high-powered flashlight toward the ceiling. The glowing beam instantly revealed an enormous, intense, dark mass standing perfectly still near the broken attic hatch. The strange, dark anomaly lacked any discernible biological features and completely blocked the normal ambient light filtering indoors. Records conflict regarding exactly how long he silently, terrifyingly watched the imposing tall anomaly before it slowly retreated. Afternoon light clearly revealed that his specialized digital measurement equipment was completely shattered into tiny, useless pieces. Robert frantically, urgently decided he absolutely needed to abandon his remaining inspection gear and hike toward his truck. He soon realized his reliable backup analog compass was constantly displaying completely erratic, unexplainable, heavy magnetic directional headings. He was effectively completely disoriented inside a massive, unforgiving wilderness region known for permanently confusing, highly experienced outdoorsmen. The desperate, anxious appraiser decided to blindly, consistently follow the overgrown driveway path, hoping it safely intersected pavement. He hiked for 2 grueling, painful hours through thick, thorny underbrush while constantly feeling intensely, directly, violently watched. Archive notes from Robert stated he repeatedly caught brief, terrifying glimpses of pale, smooth, large objects moving swiftly. Every single time he abruptly stopped to firmly point out the hidden observer, the pale, unknown shapes vanished. Utter physical, mental exhaustion eventually heavily forced him to quickly establish a completely vulnerable, unprotected rest stop briefly. He huddled tightly, safely against a large oak tree while strongly clutching his sturdy walking stick for protection. Around late afternoon, the surrounding dark, dense woods suddenly fell, totally dead silent, as wild birds completely stopped. A deep, guttural, mechanical humming sound slowly, continuously began to violently vibrate through the damp dirt beneath him. Some locals claimed strange underground natural gas releases occasionally plagued the Appalachian region, but geologists officially found nothing. Robert frantically, aggressively scanned the pitch-black distant tree line with his heavy flashlight, but the battery died. He screamed out loudly in absolute, sheer, unadulterated terror when a tall, pale, smooth shape casually stepped forward. The towering, featureless, pale entity did not overtly, aggressively attack him, but simply stood motionless, completely staring blankly. Robert slowly, hesitantly reached for his heavy orange safety whistle, but his frozen, numb fingers were constantly trembling. The bizarre, towering, unknown creature emitted another deep, deafening humming vocalization that violently, instantly rattled his internal chest. Plunged into total, suffocating, pitch-black panic, the terrified appraiser blindly, frantically ran into the treacherous, dense woods. He hopelessly, blindly sprinted continuously through the thick, tangled brush until he eventually physically collapsed near the highway. A commercial delivery truck driver miraculously happily found Robert wandering aimlessly near a heavily designated rural gravel shoulder. The older traumatized appraiser was severely badly dehydrated and suffering from multiple minor bleeding lacerations caused by branches. State records confirm he was quickly, safely, immediately transported to a local regional medical hospital and strictly treated. When heavily armed local police deputies eventually carefully navigated back to retrieve the abandoned property, they discovered chaos. The heavy, durable wooden cabin doors were entirely melted into toxic puddles and all metal hinges twisted. The intense subsequent official police investigation failed to produce any logical, rational, scientific answers regarding the strange destruction. Law enforcement officials strongly, firmly suspected a highly aggressive local squatter had simply violently rigged the deserted property. However, they absolutely could not logically, realistically explain how the heavy wooden framing was completely melted by temperatures. The overwhelming, putrid atmospheric sulfur smell and the highly localized underground ground vibrations also strictly remained completely unsolved. Robert permanently fully abandoned his promising county property appraisal career and rapidly moved to a bustling, noisy city. He completely, absolutely, strictly refused to conduct any further public media interviews regarding his terrifying, unexplainable cabin experiences. He eventually, quietly, safely wrote a highly obscure, completely anonymous internet blog detailing his intense, lingering, severe trauma. Reportedly, he deeply severely suffered from chronic, daily heavy insomnia and constant, terrifying nightmares featuring tall, smooth entities. Dispatch logs regularly show he frequently, frantically called local urban police authorities, continually complaining about heavy vibrations. The actual, true, physical nature of what currently securely resides deep inside that rugged Appalachian cabin remains unspoken. In this new story, for more than a century, the mountains of West Virginia have challenged investigators in ways few other places have. Dense forests, abandoned mining roads, isolated valleys, and unpredictable weather have often complicated even the most straightforward investigations. Most missing hikers are eventually found. Most vehicle accidents are reconstructed. Most emergency calls end with reasonable explanations. Yet, every so often, a case emerges that refuses to fit within ordinary investigative methods. One such investigation began during the final weekend of September 2018, when a routine welfare check along an old fire tower road slowly transformed into one of the most perplexing unsolved cases ever handled by a rural sheriff's office. The investigation centered on Black Ridge, a heavily wooded mountain overlooking a small community in Pocahontas County. The ridge was accessible only by a narrow gravel road originally built decades earlier to service a now abandoned fire observation tower. Although hikers occasionally visited the summit during daylight hours, local residents rarely traveled the road after sunset because fallen trees, loose rock, and steep drop-offs made nighttime driving especially dangerous. On the evening of September 29th, a volunteer firefighter contacted the sheriff's office after noticing a blue station wagon parked beside the abandoned tower long after the surrounding recreation area had officially closed. The vehicle's headlights were off, yet its parking lights remained illuminated as though someone intended to return within a few minutes. Deputies arrived shortly before 11 o'clock, expecting to locate campers or photographers watching the stars from the summit. Instead, they found the station wagon completely empty. The keys remained in the ignition, the driver's wallet rested inside the center console, and a folded hiking map lay open across the passenger seat. The vehicle showed no signs of mechanical failure, recent collision damage, or forced entry. More unusually, investigators discovered a thermos of coffee that was still warm enough to suggest its owner had left the vehicle only a short time before deputies arrived. The surrounding silence seemed ordinary for a mountain after dark, yet the complete absence of any nearby person immediately raised concerns that the driver might have suffered a medical emergency somewhere along the ridge. Search teams assembled before midnight and began working outward from the abandoned vehicle. Experienced tracking dogs quickly identified a scent leading away from the parking area toward the remains of the old fire tower. Investigators followed the trail across a narrow footpath covered with fallen leaves before reaching the tower's concrete foundation, where the dogs unexpectedly stopped. Handlers attempted several restarts from different directions, but every effort ended at exactly the same location. Beyond the foundation, neither dogs nor searchers located additional evidence indicating where the missing individual had gone. Fresh rain earlier that afternoon had softened the soil surrounding the summit, yet investigators found only one continuous set of footprints leading from the vehicle to the tower. No return tracks appeared anywhere nearby. At first daylight, the search expanded dramatically. State police helicopters equipped with thermal imaging scanned the surrounding mountains, while volunteer rescue teams divided the forest into carefully measured grid sections. Rangers familiar with the terrain searched abandoned logging trails, rock outcrops, and drainage channels where an injured hiker might have become trapped. Mine safety officials inspected several collapsed entrances located miles away, despite little evidence suggesting the missing person had traveled that far. By the end of the third day, more than 100 volunteers had searched nearly 2,000 acres without locating a single additional clue. The only confirmed evidence remained the station wagon, the footprints ending at the fire tower, and the unanswered question of why no trace continued beyond that point. Investigators soon identified the vehicle's owner as 51-year-old Thomas Granger, an amateur landscape photographer from Elkins who frequently spent weekends documenting remote Appalachian overlooks. Family members described him as meticulous, experienced outdoors, and deeply familiar with the region's mountain roads. Camera equipment recovered from the vehicle contained dozens of photographs taken throughout the afternoon, beginning with rivers, abandoned barns, and autumn forests, before ending with several images of the fire tower shortly before sunset. Nothing in the photographs suggested danger or unusual activity. Analysts carefully reviewed every image, enlarging reflections inside windows, shadows between trees, and distant ridgelines. No unidentified people, vehicles, or wildlife appeared in any frame. Digital evidence offered little additional guidance. Granger's mobile phone last connected to a nearby cellular tower at 8:47 p.m. before losing reception, an expected occurrence given the mountainous terrain. GPS information extracted from his camera confirmed he had remained near the summit throughout the evening. His credit cards showed no activity after purchasing fuel nearly 3 hours earlier, while bank records revealed no unusual financial transactions before his disappearance. Detectives considered the possibility that he had intentionally left the area on foot, but his backpack, flashlight, cold weather jacket, and overnight supplies all remained inside the vehicle. Friends later remarked that Granger never explored unfamiliar trails without carrying at least basic emergency equipment. On the sixth day of the investigation, a forestry employee made a discovery that briefly renewed hope. Less than half a mile from the abandoned fire tower, searchers located Granger's camera lens cap resting beside a moss-covered boulder overlooking a steep valley. The item showed no weather damage despite several days of rain, suggesting it had not been lying there since the initial search began. Detectives immediately returned to the area, expecting to uncover additional evidence. Intensive searches lasting another 48 hours produced nothing else. Forensic testing confirmed the lens cap belonged to Granger's camera, yet investigators could not determine how it reached a location that had already been searched repeatedly by trained personnel. Months later, after active search operations had concluded, detectives completed a final reconstruction of Granger's known movements. Every verified fact supported a simple timeline until the moment he left his vehicle. After that point, the evidence became increasingly difficult to reconcile. The footprints clearly demonstrated he walked toward the abandoned fire tower. The tracking dogs independently confirmed the same route. The photographs established that he had remained calm only minutes earlier. Yet no physical evidence explained how an experienced outdoorsman disappeared from an exposed mountain summit without leaving behind additional tracks, discarded equipment, signs of injury, or indications that another person had been present. The case remains officially open today as an unresolved missing person investigation. Every few years, advances in forensic technology prompt investigators to re-examine the physical evidence preserved from the original search, hoping overlooked details might finally connect the missing pieces of the timeline. So far, none have. Among retired deputies and volunteer rescuers who spent long days combing the forests of Black Ridge, the investigation is remembered not because of what they found, but because of what they never did. In a place where rain preserves footprints, experienced search teams rarely miss obvious evidence, and mountain trails usually tell a clear story. One ordinary autumn evening ended with a trail that simply stopped. For those who worked the case, that unfinished path remains one of the most haunting unsolved stories ever to emerge from the mountains of West Virginia. In this new story, few places attract curiosity like an abandoned house standing alone at the end of an overgrown road. To some, they are forgotten pieces of local history. To photographers, they are reminders of communities that slowly disappeared over time. To police officers and firefighters, they are simply dangerous structures waiting to collapse. Yet every so often, investigators respond to one of these forgotten homes, expecting to deal with trespassers or vandalism, only to discover a situation that refuses to follow ordinary logic. One of the most unsettling cases occurred during the spring of 2019 in a remote section of western Pennsylvania, where an abandoned Victorian farmhouse became the focus of an investigation that lasted nearly 2 months. Long after the property was demolished, those who entered the house agreed on one thing. They wished they had turned around before opening the front door. The farmhouse had been built in the early 1900s and overlooked what had once been a thriving coal community. By 2019, nearly every neighboring home had either collapsed or been removed, leaving the property isolated among acres of second-growth forest. County records showed the house had remained vacant for almost 18 years following the death of its final owner. Electricity, water, and natural gas had all been disconnected, while foreclosure proceedings left ownership tied up in legal disputes that prevented redevelopment. Aside from occasional inspections by county officials, nobody was supposed to enter the building. That changed after local hunters began reporting signs that someone was regularly occupying the upstairs rooms despite no vehicles ever being seen nearby. The reports initially seemed routine. Hunters described curtains moving behind broken windows, footsteps echoing across the second floor shortly before sunrise, and fresh tire tracks appearing on the muddy access road before vanishing several hundred yards from the property. Deputies assumed squatters had found a way inside and scheduled a daytime inspection. The search revealed no evidence of recent occupation. Dust covered every floor, bird nests filled several bedrooms, and rainwater had begun rotting portions of the roof. Kitchen cabinets remained empty, fireplaces contained years of accumulated debris, and no food, clothing, bedding, or personal belongings suggested anyone had spent even a single night inside. Investigators documented the property before leaving, convinced the complaints had been exaggerated. 3 evenings later, County Dispatch received another call, this time from a volunteer firefighter, returning home after a training exercise. While passing the abandoned farmhouse, he noticed a faint orange glow coming from an upstairs bedroom overlooking the valley. Believing trespassers might have started a fire inside the deteriorating structure, he immediately contacted emergency services. Engine crews arrived within 12 minutes expecting flames or smoke. Instead, they found the building completely dark. Thermal imaging cameras detected no elevated temperatures anywhere inside the house, and firefighters found no evidence that a fire had recently burned. Yet, the responding lieutenant later confirmed that the upstairs window had clearly appeared illuminated while approaching the property from the road. Concerned that someone might be entering and leaving before responders arrived, detectives requested permission to install motion-activated cameras around the exterior. 4 cameras monitored every accessible entrance, while an additional unit overlooked the staircase leading to the second floor. The surveillance system operated continuously for 21 days. During that time, it captured deer, coyotes, raccoons, wild turkeys, and countless smaller animals moving around the abandoned house. It never recorded a single person approaching the property. Nevertheless, dispatch continued receiving occasional reports from passing motorists describing lights in the upstairs bedroom during the early hours before dawn. Investigators eventually decided to remain inside the farmhouse overnight. Shortly before midnight, 2 detectives, a county fire investigator, and a structural engineer entered the building carrying battery-powered lighting, portable radios, and environmental monitoring equipment. Their objective was simple. If someone entered the property, they intended to observe exactly how access had been gained. The first several hours passed without incident. Wind moved through broken windows, loose floorboards creaked under changing temperatures, and wildlife occasionally rustled outside. Everything matched what the investigators expected from an abandoned structure that had stood empty for nearly 2 decades. At approximately 2:43 a.m., one detective noticed an unusual sound coming from the upper hallway. It was not loud enough to identify immediately, but everyone inside heard it at nearly the same moment. The sound resembled the slow movement of wooden furniture being dragged across an old floor. Believing someone had entered through an unseen opening, the investigators climbed the staircase together and searched every room one by one. Each bedroom remained exactly as documented during previous inspections. Layers of dust remained undisturbed, windows were locked from the inside, and no footprints appeared on the floor beyond those made by the investigators themselves. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had begun and never repeated during the remainder of the night. The following morning, technicians downloaded every surveillance recording collected during the overnight operation. The exterior cameras showed no activity around the house. The interior camera, aimed directly at the staircase, revealed the investigators ascending together after hearing the unexplained sound. Nothing unusual appeared before or after that moment. Audio analysis, however, detected the same scraping noise recorded simultaneously by 3 separate body cameras carried by investigators on the second floor. Because the sound originated on independent recording devices positioned in different rooms, forensic analysts concluded it had occurred within the building itself rather than through radio interference or equipment malfunction. Even so, no source could be identified. Several weeks later, engineers determined the deteriorating farmhouse posed an immediate safety risk and recommended demolition. Before heavy machinery arrived, investigators completed one final examination, hoping structural removal might reveal concealed rooms, hidden crawl spaces, or evidence of unauthorized occupation overlooked during earlier searches. They found nothing. Once the building had been reduced to its foundation, the county graded the site and removed the remaining debris. From that day forward, no additional reports of lights, footsteps, or unexplained activity were ever received from the location. The investigation officially closed without identifying trespassers, criminal activity, or a mechanical explanation for the repeated witness reports. Detectives involved in the case have consistently avoided describing the farmhouse as haunted. emphasizing that the evidence never supported such a conclusion. What they do acknowledge is far simpler. Independent witnesses repeatedly described the same upstairs room. Firefighters personally observed a light that left no physical trace. Investigators recorded an unexplained sound inside an otherwise empty structure, while every entrance remained under surveillance. None of those observations proved anything extraordinary, but together they created a case that resisted every ordinary explanation. Years later, among those who walked through the abandoned farmhouse, believing they were about to solve a simple trespassing complaint, the memory that remains strongest is not what they discovered inside. It is the lingering realization that they left with fewer answers than they had when they first stepped through the front door. What hikers reported deep in the wilderness still doesn't make sense. In late summer of 2011, several unrelated hikers reported nearly identical experiences deep within a remote section of western North Carolina. Their accounts were recorded months apart, yet many details appeared unusually consistent. Dispatch logs, archived ranger notes, and later witness interviews preserved fragments of those reports, though investigators never reached a conclusion that satisfied everyone involved. One of the earliest reports came from Corbin Voss, a 37-year-old survey technician from Tennessee who spent weekends hiking remote trails. He entered the Pisgah region alone during a 3-day backpacking trip and planned to document several abandoned logging routes. According to trail records, he checked in at a ranger station shortly after sunrise and appeared calm before beginning his hike. Weather conditions remained stable throughout the day, and no warnings had been issued for that section of forest. Corbin covered nearly 12 miles before establishing camp near a narrow ridge overlooking a heavily wooded valley. He later stated that nothing unusual occurred until shortly after dusk, when distant sounds began echoing through the trees. At first, he assumed another group occupied a nearby campsite, though no fires or lights appeared anywhere below him. The sounds reportedly resembled brief conversations carried by wind, yet every attempt to identify their source failed. Around 10 that evening, Corbin heard what he believed were footsteps approaching from the eastern side of camp. The movement stopped whenever he shined his flashlight toward the trees. Several minutes later, the same pattern repeated from a different direction. He described the experience in a written statement submitted after returning home. According to archive notes, he eventually remained awake until dawn because the sounds continued at irregular intervals. The following morning revealed no obvious explanation. Corbin found no footprints near his campsite, despite damp soil that should have preserved tracks clearly. He also noticed something that later became important during the investigation. Several small stones had been arranged beside the trail leading away from camp. The formation appeared deliberate, though investigators later suggested natural causes could not be ruled out. Corbin photographed the stones before continuing his hike deeper into the wilderness. Approximately 4 months later, a second report emerged from a woman named Tessa Crowley, a 42-year-old physical therapist from Virginia. She visited the same general region while training for a long-distance hiking event. Tessa reportedly knew nothing about Corbin's experience. Nevertheless, her statement contained details that closely matched information contained within county files from earlier reports. Rangers noticed the similarities only after reviewing records during the following year. Tessa spent 2 nights in the forest and described hearing distant voices after dark. She could never distinguish actual words, though the sounds consistently resembled conversations taking place beyond visual range. During her second evening, she reportedly heard footsteps circling her campsite for nearly an hour. Whenever she moved toward the noise, complete silence followed immediately. Investigators later confirmed that no other hikers had registered nearby during that period. The most unusual detail appeared shortly before sunrise. Tessa woke unexpectedly and discovered several stones arranged near a fallen log approximately 30 yards from camp. She later claimed the arrangement had not been present before darkness arrived. Archived ranger notes from 2012 mention photographs taken at the scene. though some records indicate those images were later misplaced. Investigators never confirmed whether the stones had any connection to other reports. As similar accounts accumulated, officials began examining earlier records stored in regional archives. A county file from 2009 referenced a search and rescue volunteer who described hearing distant conversations while assisting during a missing person operation. Another report from 2007 mentioned unexplained footsteps around a temporary camp established by forestry workers. Although details varied, recurring elements appeared often enough to attract attention from local authorities. By 2013, discussions about the reports reached several outdoor organizations operating throughout the Appalachian region. Some members believed environmental conditions created auditory distortions capable of producing convincing illusions. Others pointed toward wildlife activity, arguing that unfamiliar sounds frequently become exaggerated after darkness settles across remote landscapes. Investigators explored both possibilities, yet neither explanation accounted for every detail contained within witness statements. Records conflict regarding several observations, leaving significant gaps in the timeline. One incident from that year generated particular interest. A pair of hikers named Leland Burke and Owen Mercer entered the wilderness for a weekend photography trip. Both men were experienced outdoorsmen who routinely traveled through isolated terrain. According to their statements, they heard voices shortly after sunset while preparing dinner beside a stream. Neither individual could identify specific words, though both agreed the sounds resembled a conversation occurring just beyond sight. Leland later reported seeing a light moving slowly between distant trees across the valley. The light appeared briefly before disappearing behind thick vegetation. Owen claimed he never observed it directly, creating one of several conflicting details found throughout the case. Investigators never confirmed whether another group occupied the area that night. Searches conducted afterward located no campsites, discarded equipment, or evidence suggesting recent human activity nearby. The following morning produced another familiar discovery. Several stones rested beside the trail leading away from their campsite. Unlike previous reports, the arrangement formed a rough line extending toward denser forest. Leland photographed the scene and submitted copies during a later interview. Some locals claimed similar markers occasionally appeared throughout remote sections of the region. Investigators never confirmed those accounts and found little supporting documentation. As years passed, additional reports continued appearing within archive notes and ranger files. Many involved experienced hikers who demonstrated familiarity with wilderness conditions. Most accounts described sounds rather than visual encounters. Voices remained the most common element, followed closely by footsteps approaching campsites after dark. While each report contained differences, enough similarities existed to keep the mystery alive among those familiar with regional records. Researchers examining the case proposed several theories. Certain environmental specialists suggested unusual terrain features might reflect sound across valleys in unexpected ways. Under specific conditions, conversations occurring miles away could reportedly seem much closer than reality. Wildlife experts offered alternative explanations involving nocturnal animals whose calls occasionally resemble human voices. Neither theory addressed the recurring stone arrangements mentioned across multiple reports, separated by years and involving unrelated witnesses. A review conducted during 2019 attempted to organize every available statement into a single timeline. Investigators compared dispatch logs, archive notes, witness interviews, and state records gathered over more than a decade. Their findings revealed no evidence of criminal activity, organized hoaxes, or coordinated fabrication. However, they also failed to identify any explanation capable of connecting every reported detail. Several key documents referenced observations that could no longer be verified because supporting material had disappeared. Today, hikers continue traveling through the same wilderness without incident every year. Most never experience anything unusual and return home with ordinary stories about mountain views and long trails. Yet, scattered among those routine accounts remain a small number of reports that sound remarkably similar to statements recorded years earlier. Investigators never confirmed what caused the voices, the footsteps, or the carefully placed stones. Deep within that section of forest, what several hikers reported still doesn't make sense. The unmarked road, hidden deep in Appalachia. Deep in the heavily forested Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia, a lost driver experienced a completely unexplainable, terrifying event. During the bitter winter of 2020, a dedicated commercial trucker encountered something that defies basic, logical, scientific explanation. What local authorities eventually uncovered completely destroyed the quiet, peaceful illusion of that specific, dark, rural mountain community forever. Archive notes from the massive official investigation describe a highly disturbing timeline of events that still haunts state police today. 42-year-old Arthur Pendleton worked as a dedicated commercial transport driver, simply trying to finish his route. His isolated route forced him through a highly outdated rural mountainous region located miles away from any major modern interstates. His primary daily objective required him to safely deliver heavy industrial equipment completely alone during the long, dark winter nights. The county file from 2009 actually mentioned several highly unusual missing traveler cases originating from that exact region. Arthur arrived on November 12th and immediately began carefully navigating the icy, narrow roads while listening to the quiet radio. The first quiet, freezing hours passed entirely without any significant dangerous incidents, as the exhausted driver cautiously navigated sharp turns. State records confirm that severe, scattered winter storms unexpectedly bypassed their specific elevation despite highly ominous regional weather forecast predictions. However, Arthur stopped his massive truck shortly after midnight because he clearly saw a massive fallen tree blocking the highway. He initially assumed a severe winter windstorm had aggressively knocked the massive dead pine completely across the designated rural road. When he cautiously looked directly at his digital navigation map, he noticed a highly obscure, unmarked dirt bypass road nearby. Arthur aggressively turned his heavy commercial vehicle onto the unpaved path, hoping to safely bypass the massive, solid wooden obstruction. The highly stressful situation escalated drastically during that dark hour when an awful chemical smell suddenly arrived continuously inside there. Reportedly, the foul, suffocating odor tightly resembled burning synthetic plastic, mixed heavily with the sharp scent of raw industrial sulfur. The isolated, terrified driver immediately started coughing violently and aggressively struggling to breathe properly inside the completely sealed truck cabin. Arthur quickly grabbed his portable emergency radio to call for immediate outside medical assistance, but only received loud, aggressive static. Dispatch logs show no emergency distress calls were ever successfully officially recorded by the regional sheriff department during that night. Suddenly, a massive, unseen, heavy physical force violently shook the solid dirt foundation and violently rattled the thick truck windows. Arthur scrambled frantically behind the heavy wooden steering wheel and desperately aimed his high-powered security flashlight toward the trees. The glowing beam instantly revealed an enormous, intense, dark mass standing perfectly still directly behind the parked commercial delivery truck. The strange, dark anomaly lacked any discernible biological features and completely blocked the normal, bright, ambient light from the moon. Records conflict regarding exactly how long he silently, terrifyingly watched the imposing tall anomaly before it slowly, finally, silently retreated. Arthur frantically, urgently insisted he absolutely needed to completely abandon the dangerous dirt road and aggressively reverse his heavy vehicle. He completely strongly pushed the heavy transmission lever, but he soon realized the main electrical engine panel was displaying sparks. He was effectively hopelessly trapped inside a massive, unforgiving wilderness region known for permanently disorienting, highly experienced commercial delivery drivers. The desperate, anxious driver decided to blindly, violently run toward the back, hoping to retrieve his heavy defensive metal tools. He confidently, blindly sprinted continuously through the freezing dark dirt road until he eventually physically discovered massive, strange, deep tracks. Arthur remained entirely, completely, silently hidden behind the thick, solid metal trailer while intensely listening for any sudden, aggressive movements. Archived notes from Arthur stated he repeatedly caught brief, terrifying glimpses of pale, smooth, large objects moving swiftly near trees. Every single time he abruptly, cautiously raised his head to firmly point out the hidden observer, the pale shapes vanished. Utter physical mental exhaustion eventually heavily forced him to quickly, carefully establish a completely vulnerable, unprotected defensive position down low. He huddled tightly safely against the heavy metal tires while strongly clutching a heavy steel wrench for absolutely necessary protection. Around 2 in the freezing morning, the surrounding dark, dense woods suddenly fell, totally dead silent as freezing winds stopped. A deep, guttural, mechanical humming sound slowly, continuously began to violently vibrate through the damp dirt beneath the rubber tires. Some locals claimed strange underground natural gas releases occasionally plagued the Appalachian region, but geologists officially formally found zero evidence. Arthur frantically, aggressively scanned the pitch-black distant tree line with his heavy flashlight, but the expensive digital battery died. He silently screamed internally in absolute, sheer, unadulterated terror when a tall, pale, smooth shape casually stepped near the vehicle. The towering, featureless, pale entity did not overtly, aggressively attack the reinforced metal, but simply stood motionless, completely staring blankly. Arthur slowly, hesitantly gripped his heavy steel wrench tightly, but his frozen, numb fingers were constantly heavily trembling, extremely violently. The bizarre, towering, unknown creature emitted another deep, deafening, humming vocalization that violently, instantly, completely shattered the thick truck windows. Plunged into total, suffocating, pitch-black darkness outside the truck, the terrified driver blindly, frantically crawled toward the deep brush. He hopelessly, blindly waited continuously inside the highly secure, hidden, thorny bush until the early morning sunlight eventually safely arrived. A commercial timber delivery operator miraculously happily found the rural vehicle completely abandoned near the heavily designated gravel access channel. The highly traumatized young driver was severely, badly dehydrated and suffering from multiple minor bleeding lacerations caused by broken glass. State records confirm he was quickly, safely, immediately transported to a local regional medical hospital and strictly treated for shock. When heavily armed local police deputies eventually carefully, safely navigated back to retrieve the abandoned truck, they discovered sheer chaos. The heavy, durable steel vehicle doors were completely, entirely melted into toxic puddles, and all metal engine components were twisted. Arthur was tragically, completely unable to mentally process his terrifying experience, despite the massive, highly coordinated regional psychological support presence. Highly trained tracking search dogs completely, entirely lost any distinct individual scent trails near the steep edge of the woods. Law enforcement officials strongly, firmly suspected the blindly, quickly fleeing driver accidentally, entirely hallucinated the terrifying, massive, deep, dark entity. However, they absolutely could not logically, realistically explain how the heavy steel doors were completely melted by extreme high temperatures. The overwhelming, putrid atmospheric sulfur smell and the highly localized underground ground vibrations also strictly remained completely, totally, officially unsolved. Arthur completely, permanently, fully abandoned his promising commercial transport delivery plans and rapidly moved to a bustling, noisy, populated city. He completely, absolutely, strictly refused to conduct any further public media interviews regarding his terrifying, unexplainable, deep, dark road experiences. He eventually, quietly, safely wrote a highly obscure, completely anonymous internet blog detailing his intense, lingering, severe, heavy psychological trauma. Reportedly, he deeply, severely suffered from chronic daily heavy insomnia and constant terrifying nightmares featuring tall, faceless, smooth, looming entities. Dispatch logs routinely regularly show he frequently frantically called local urban police authorities, continually complaining about strange, heavy mechanical vibrations. The deep, dark, isolated, unmarked mountain road remains mostly completely thoroughly abandoned and deeply heavily feared by many local residents. Experienced local rural highway patrolmen actively, aggressively, strictly discourage overly ambitious amateur novice drivers from widely exploring that specific acreage. Official public state records conflict regarding the actual, total, highly accurate number of missing traveler cases strictly linked to wilderness. Some ambitious, independent amateur internet investigators occasionally dangerously completely venture into the dark, unmarked road, hoping to finally capture evidence. Most of them always safely return completely empty-handed, while a few others quickly emerge with deeply unsettling, disturbing stories. The absolute, total, complete lack of any definitive, hard physical evidence heavily, continually, profoundly frustrates those who genuinely believe Arthur. The completely destroyed internal security cameras conveniently, completely, permanently erased any potential digital visual proof of the giant outside entity. Vociferous internet online skeptics constantly, loudly, aggressively argue that sheer blind panic and total utter darkness easily successfully transformed reality. Archive notes carefully, thoroughly gathered from the official local police investigation confidently, strictly concluded that an undocumented toxic gas leaked. Yet the exact, highly specific, true physical origin nature of those massive, perfectly smooth circular tracks remains completely officially contested. University biology science experts quickly, easily, permanently dismiss the crazy, ridiculous, bizarre idea of a completely unknown, massive humanoid animal. They firmly, constantly, strongly argue that an active, healthy, massive breeding population of large hidden creatures would leave physical evidence. No unusual animal organic hair samples or strange skeletal biological bone remains have ever been definitively, positively, completely, conclusively linked. Some locals claimed the federal, national, centralized government quietly, aggressively, permanently suppressed the actual truth to secretly protect classified operations. Investigators never confirmed any grand, illegal, hidden conspiracy and simply, safely, permanently, officially closed the bizarre, terrifying, unmarked road case. Arthur constantly refuses to leave his secure concrete urban apartment whenever the winter season finally slowly descends upon the city. He strictly, violently demands that every single heavy deadbolt lock remains securely fastened throughout the entire duration of the night. The actual, absolute, terrifying truth hiding deep within those ancient, desolate Appalachian mountains might never be completely, fully understood logically. Perhaps some dense, dark, forgotten regions of the deep American wilderness are genuinely meant to remain completely, entirely undiscovered forever. In this news story, most visitors entered Appalachia expecting breathtaking overlooks, quiet rivers, and endless forests painted with brilliant autumn colors. They planned scenic drives through mountain passes where every curve revealed another postcard view. Few realized those same roads carried generations of stories that never appeared in travel brochures. Long before highways connected distant towns, narrow mountain routes linked isolated communities that depended entirely on one another. Families remembered every bridge, every abandoned church, and every forgotten cemetery hidden among the ridges. Some roads eventually gained quiet reputations that locals rarely discussed with strangers. The warnings usually arrived as simple advice rather than dramatic ghost stories. Older residents suggested reaching the next town before sunset or choosing the longer highway instead of certain backroads. They almost never explained why. For most travelers, those conversations sounded like ordinary mountain folklore. Only years later did some realize they had unknowingly driven through places where unexplained experiences had been reported for generations. One autumn evening, the Harris family began what they believed would become another unforgettable drive through the Appalachian Mountains. Mark Harris enjoyed photographing abandoned structures, while his wife Jennifer preferred documenting forgotten churches, one-room schoolhouses, and historic cemeteries scattered throughout rural valleys. Their teenage son Ethan spent most trips recording video for a travel channel dedicated to overlooked destinations across America. They had already crossed thousands of miles without experiencing anything stranger than unexpected wildlife crossing the road. Careful planning, reliable equipment, and years of experience convinced them they understood mountain travel better than most tourists. Nothing suggested this journey would become the only trip they refused to repeat. Their route followed a collection of state highways winding through remote sections of eastern Appalachia, where towns sometimes stood nearly 40 miles apart. Cellular reception faded shortly after leaving the interstate. Paper maps replaced navigation apps because the surrounding mountains frequently interrupted satellite signals. The family welcomed the isolation. Modern distractions disappeared almost immediately, leaving only forests stretching endlessly beyond both sides of the pavement. Occasional wooden signs pointed toward communities with populations smaller than a single city block elsewhere in the country. Weather remained perfect throughout the afternoon. Blue skies reflected across narrow rivers flowing beside the highway, while cool mountain air drifted through open windows, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and damp earth. Shortly before sunset, they stopped at a family-owned diner overlooking a small valley. Local residents filled nearly every table despite the quiet weekday evening. Conversations centered around hunting season, changing weather, and roads damaged during previous winters. When Mark casually mentioned their planned route across an older mountain highway, several conversations briefly stopped before continuing as though nothing had happened. Their waitress hesitated only long enough to ask whether they intended driving that road after dark. Mark answered yes, because the next motel remained less than 90 miles away. She nodded politely before recommending they leave immediately rather than waiting for dessert. Her tone carried concern instead of fear, making the advice strangely memorable. The highway narrowed within minutes after leaving town. Fresh pavement gradually gave way to older asphalt, patched repeatedly over decades. Guardrails disappeared along several steep curves overlooking valleys that vanished beneath growing darkness. Dense hardwood forests pressed tightly against both sides of the road until branches formed a tunnel overhead. Traffic became almost non-existent. During nearly 40 minutes, they encountered only one pickup truck traveling in the opposite direction. Its driver briefly flashed headlights twice before disappearing around the next bend. Jennifer assumed the signal warned about deer farther ahead. Ethan continued filming through the windshield, hoping to capture the fading evening light filtering between towering ridges. Darkness arrived much faster than expected beneath the forest canopy. Mark switched to high beams, revealing countless tree trunks standing like silent walls only a few feet beyond the pavement. Fog slowly gathered inside low valleys before drifting upward across the highway. Visibility remained acceptable, yet every curve looked strangely similar to the previous one. Ethan eventually lowered his camera after noticing something unusual. Mile markers seemed inconsistent. Marker 63 appeared first, followed several minutes later by marker 61. Another curve revealed marker 64 again. Mark assumed he had simply misread them while concentrating on the winding road. Ethan replayed his recording and quietly confirmed the numbers appeared exactly as remembered. Jennifer unfolded their paper map beneath the interior light. According to the route, they should have reached a small crossroads community nearly 15 minutes earlier. Instead, the forest continued uninterrupted in every direction. No driveways appeared, no mailboxes stood beside the pavement, even electrical lines seemed to vanish beyond the last ridge they crossed. The silence outside gradually became noticeable. Normally, mountain roads echoed with insects, distant streams, or occasional owls. Here, the surrounding forest appeared completely still, despite gentle wind moving across the higher slopes. When Mark lowered his window for several seconds, he heard nothing except the steady hum of the engine. Another 20 minutes passed before headlights illuminated an old white church standing beside the road. A narrow cemetery surrounded the building behind a weathered iron fence leaning noticeably toward the hillside. Jennifer asked whether they could stop for photographs the following morning because moonlight gave the place an unusual appearance. Mark slowed slightly but continued driving. Less than 10 minutes later, Ethan looked up from his camera and quietly asked why they were passing the same church again. Nobody answered immediately. The identical leaning fence, cracked front steps, and broken stained glass window stood exactly where they had appeared before. Mark insisted another church probably resembled the first one because many rural congregations used nearly identical architecture. Ethan remained unconvinced after comparing both video clips side by side. The family finally reached a narrow bridge crossing a shallow creek. Beside the entrance stood an old wooden warning sign faded almost beyond recognition. Jennifer noticed a distinctive lightning-shaped crack running through one corner of the board. 15 minutes later, another bridge appeared. The same crack marked another weathered sign, standing in exactly the same position. Ethan searched his earlier footage again before quietly showing the screen to his parents. Every knot in the wood matched perfectly. Even missing paint formed identical patterns. Mark felt the first genuine wave of uncertainty since entering the mountains. He checked the odometer. According to the vehicle, they had traveled nearly 60 additional miles, yet every landmark suggested otherwise. Concern slowly replaced curiosity. Mark attempted turning onto the first side road they encountered, hoping it would reconnect with another highway. Less than 5 minutes later, the narrow lane curved unexpectedly before returning to the same main road from the opposite direction. The old bridge stood ahead once again. Jennifer suggested consulting a compass stored inside the glove compartment. The needle refused to settle in one direction, drifting slowly before stopping, then turning again without obvious reason. Ethan tried restarting his phone, even though no signal remained available. The digital map loaded briefly before displaying their location several counties away, then disappeared completely. None of the devices agreed with one another. Shortly after midnight, another vehicle finally appeared behind them. Relief spread through the family until Jennifer noticed something unsettling. The headlights never seemed to grow closer, despite following for nearly 15 minutes. They remained the same distance back through every curve, occasionally disappearing behind hills before returning exactly where they had been before. Mark reduced speed, hoping the driver would pass. The lights slowed as well. He accelerated slightly. They matched his pace again without gaining or falling farther behind. Ethan filmed through the rear window until the headlights vanished completely while rounding one sharp bend. The road behind them remained empty for miles afterward. Nearly an hour later, they reached a small gas station illuminated by a single fluorescent light. Relief quickly turned into confusion after discovering the pumps covered with rust and weeds growing through cracked concrete. Dust coated every window. The building had obviously been abandoned for years. Jennifer later recalled feeling certain she had seen the lights glowing from nearly a mile away, yet no electrical service appeared connected anywhere on the property. Ethan photographed the station before they continued driving. The digital timestamps on every image later showed conflicting times despite being taken only seconds apart. Some indicated photographs captured before they entered the highway, while others appeared almost 2 hours into the future. No explanation ever accounted for the corrupted sequence. The highway finally emerged from the mountains shortly before dawn. A larger state road appeared ahead, along with the first passing traffic they had seen in hours. They stopped at a convenience store where the cashier immediately asked whether they had spent the night on the old mountain route. Without describing their experience, Mark simply nodded. The cashier quietly explained that travelers occasionally arrived exhausted after believing they had driven in circles despite following the same highway. Most blamed heavy fog, unfamiliar terrain, or fatigue. Others refused discussing the experience altogether. Local law enforcement had investigated numerous reports over the years, yet found no damaged signs, missing intersections, or roadway defects capable of explaining why unrelated visitors described remarkably similar experiences separated by decades. Back home, the Harris family reviewed every photograph, map, and video collected during the trip. Mileage records, timestamps, and recorded landmarks refused to fit into any logical sequence. Nothing proved anything supernatural had occurred. Mountain roads, exhaustion, changing weather, and human perception could easily combine in unexpected ways. Researchers studying navigation errors have long documented how isolated environments distort distance, direction, and memory, especially after dark. Even so, one detail remained impossible for the family to ignore. Ethan's continuous dashboard recording showed the same weathered church appearing twice without any visible turnaround, intersection, or break in the journey. Every attempt to retrace the route months later failed because neither the church nor the abandoned gas station could be located where maps indicated they should have been. Today, the family still visits Appalachia, but they never travel unfamiliar mountain roads after sunset. Whenever someone asks why, they simply recommend reaching the next town before dark, repeating the same quiet advice once offered to them without explanation.